I'm happiest in the saddle.
A fellow sportsman.
I am an FBI agent!
Great Scott!
What do you say we cut the chit-chat? A-hole!
Dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria!
Come with me if you want to live.
Hello, and welcome to Retro Ramble. I'm Charlie McGee.
I'm George McGee.
And this time, Ramblers, we are moving into a new decade. Not since
a new millennium.
A new millennium. Not since Mission Impossible 2 have George and I delved into the films of the 21st century. But we are going back. We are going back to the year 2000, and we are going to be reviewing. What have we got this time, George?
X gonna give it to you. Oh, that's not the theme song, but we're gonna do X-Men.
The original X-Men.
The original. There's been many X-Men, but this is the original.
The first, and I think technically the last film of Marvel Studio Entertainment, or Marvel Entertainment Studios. Anyway, before Marvel was Marvel, they made a couple of films before they hit it big, right, George?
Before they were properly Marvel. I think this is Marvel Entertainment, but Marvel Studios and the MCU
would then,
was
so
2008. So
brought to us by the non-contentious, you wouldn't have heard of or read about him in the news, the Bryan Singer. Welcome, Bryan. Thank you for giving us Superman and X-Men. Thank you for all of the art that you've contributed to the world.
And we're just going to move on.
Yeah.
So, yes.
We come from together. So we're obviously very excited to review this film. We're going back 23 years to 2000 to review X-Men. Like anybody who's a fan of this podcast, you grew up watching one of the best cartoons ever, the X-Men cartoon. So this is hopefully a celebration of it in film format. Where are we going to go with this film, George?
Yeah, I think we'll have to touch on the cartoon, as you say. You know, it was a lot of people grew up with it, and it has arguably one of the best theme tunes ever, the catchiest theme tunes ever written. But yeah, we'll be talking about like a lot of comic book films, the long drawn out production process. There'll be some very interesting alternative casting, some script, lots of script writers worked on this one, went through a lot of people's hands. And obviously, I think we'll touch on the legacy of the X-Men films as a whole, because yeah, as we talked about, there's been a lot of them by this point. They're currently on pause because the rights are back with Marvel. But yes, there's been a lot of X-Men films since the year 2000.
Some would say enough, but no, let's take it back to the original. If you've not listened before, you don't know what to expect. If you have listened before, could you call the people who haven't listened before and tell them what to expect? But basically, George and I are brothers. We're going back. We're reviewing the films that we grew up on the rainy days in the northeast of England. We didn't have a lot to do, so we just consumed as many Hollywood blockbusters as we could in the late 80s and 90s. And that's what this podcast is all about. We are tiptoeing into the 21st century, going into X-Men. There will be more to cover. These films are like a good friend, George. We take the piss, we reminisce. It's all with love.
This is a light-hearted film review. Yeah, we're going to go into these films in detail. There will be spoilers from the off. There'll probably be some bad impressions. There might be some fruity language, so please make sure you don't have little people with sensitive ears around.
Or tiny minds.
Or tiny minds. And yes, it's there's going to be some trivia, there's going to be some jokes, and all that jazz. So you might learn something. You might laugh. We aim to entertain.
George, is the trailer ready?
It is. It's ready to go.
Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's the year 2000. It's X-Men. It's one of our first ever DVDs. We're going back there. So enjoy the show.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are now seeing the beginnings of another stage of human evolution.
Who are you people?
What kind of place is this?
Professor Charles Xavier. I built this school where mutants could learn to focus their powers in a positive way, and also learn that mankind was not evil, just uninformed. You'll be safe here from Magneto, a very powerful mutant who believes that a war is brewing between mutants and the rest of humanity.
There is a war coming. You sure you're on the right side?
I've never seen anything like this before.
We are the future, Charles, not them. They no longer matter.
Hold on to something.
Don't give up on them. Mankind has evolved, not anymore.
Is it just me, or were you getting a little bit of Danny Elfman in that music?
Oh, that had everything. That had everything in that trailer. There was your late 90s dancer, I think, was it Fluke Atom Bomb? And then there was other music borrowed from elsewhere. It was a proper,
just throw everything at it.
90s. I think it's, appeared on all the same trailers like Event Horizon and all that jazz. Throw in a bit of dance music, you get them excited.
Throw in a bit of drum and bass. So George, it's the year 2000. What will it be like in the year 2000? Will we be fully grown? Will we have X-Men? How did we get this film?
Well, we have to go back a bit. So we have to go back a few years. Probably best to go back to the 80s.
Oh, wow, that's far. I thought you were just going to go back to Blade.
No. We have to go back quite a bit. Apparently, the first sort of instance, obviously, the comics been around since, I think, the mid-60s. And it's had its ups and downs. But first plans to make it into a movie. So Marvel writers Jerry Conway and Roy Thomas wrote a screenplay when Orion Pictures held the rights to it back in 1984. So remember Orion? They were, staple. Yes, you're doing the logo thing. They were a staple production house of the 80s. I think they were behind RoboCop and Bill and Ted. But then development stalled because Orion hit financial troubles. Then, cut to a few years later, so sometime between 1989 and 1990. So, as always, all roads. I'm just filling in the blanks. All roads lead to Batman. Batman was the biggest blockbuster of 1989. So, around this time, none other than Stan the Man Lee, one of the original creators of the comic books, and Chris Claremont, who's quite a famous comic book writer, we're in discussions with Carolco Pictures. Again, another studio that's cropped up.
James Cameron?
Well, he was under the Carolco stable, so he did quite a few films for them. I think the Rambo films were Carolco. But yes, Terminator 2, Basic Instinct. So at that time, they were having discussions with James Cameron and Catherine Bigelow. So Cameron was going to produce and Catherine Bigelow was going to direct.
Wow.
Catherine Bigelow got as far as writing a treatment and suggesting a couple of stars, which I'll reveal in Coulda, Woulda, Shoulda. But then James Cameron and Stan Lee got chatting about Spider-Man, and apparently that just derailed all talks because James Cameron was really interested in making a Spider-Man film.
Who isn't interested in making a Spider-Man film like ever?
And then Carolco went bankrupt. I think which we covered that in Universal Soldier. I think that was one of the last films Carolco made. And the film rights reverted back to Marvel. And then it kind of limboed about a bit for a while. But meanwhile, 1992, the X-Men animated TV show kicked off by Marvel producer Avi Arad. So he would later produce the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man films. And I think he's still sort of linked to producing the Venom films, I think, and all those spin-offs. So yeah, he was producing the animated TV show on Fox Kids. That ran from 92 to 97. So Fox were impressed with, obviously the TV show was a big hit around the world. And so they got producer Lauren Schuler Donner to purchase the rights in 1994 for a measly sum of $2.5 million. Shula Donner brought on scriptwriter Andrew Kevin Walker, so he's most famous for writing Seven, to write the first script. So around this time, so this is 94, if we jump forward to 1995, The Usual Suspects is a huge hit. It wins Oscars for Christopher McQuarrie, a screenwriter, and it also makes director Bryan Singer one of the hottest names in Hollywood. So he is quickly approached by Fox, and Singer's keen to do a science fiction film. So the first project Fox offer him is not X-Men, it's Alien Resurrection. However, which I'm sure we'll cover at some point. However, Singer's producing partner, Tom DeSanto, was a big comic book nerd. And when he knew that Fox had X-Men, he pushed Singer to go for that. And Singer wasn't much of a comic book reader, but DeSanto said he thought that the themes of prejudice would resonate with Singer, which they duly did. They did a pitch to Fox for it, and that won over Stanley and Avi Arad.
So where are we at in the whole sort of superhero world of things? Because I shouted out earlier about Blade, but
we're not there yet.
Now that's what I'm saying. But where are we generally? Because we'd had Batman 89, and I think Returns was 91 or 92. Then we would have said 95 was Forever. So where were we? This is just DC I'm talking about, but where were we? DC was still kind of taking the paces for the comic book world.
So
getting their shit together.
Yeah, that's a very good point. This is kind of before the comic book industry, the comic book adaptation imploded with Batman and Robin. So as you said, Batman Forever was 95. Batman Robin was 97. So this is around the time of Singer was formally attached in 1996. And then over the next 3 years, there was a who's who of scriptwriters tackling the script. Meanwhile, Singer goes off to make the film Apt Pupil with starring Ian McKellen. That will come back, obviously. But yeah, between 1996 and 1999, a bunch of writers tackled it, from Ed Solomon, who wrote Bill and Ted and Men in Black, John Logan, who wrote Gladiator, James Schamus, who's one of Ang Lee's writing partners, so he wrote Crouching Tiger and would actually go on to write the first Hulk movie. A little-known director called Christopher McQuarrie, who was just a humble Oscar-winning screenwriter at that point, and none other than everyone's favorite comic book writer-director, Joss Whedon. So they all did various drafts. Ironically, despite all these A-list writers, it was a guy called David Hayter, who served as, at the time, was Bryan Singer's assistant, but he had a background as an actor and a producer. And quite amusingly, he's also the voice, I believe, of Solid Snake from Metal Gear Solid. in Snake. So yeah, he was acting at the time as Singer's assistant, and he was answering phones, he was taking all the notes, and basically he was writing the script. He was going to all these meetings, and Singer had to rely on him because Hayter was a huge X-Men fan. So he was like, oh, you just go with it. You know it. And it got to the point where one of the producers realized this is like, listen, we're going to have to start paying this guy as a writer. Otherwise we're going to get in trouble. And because of this, I think Christopher McQuarrie, these are various different sources, but Christopher McQuarrie convinced Ed Solomon for them both to take their names off it because they'd been messed around so much. Hayter claims he wrote about 55% of the script and the rest was Solomon and McQuarrie. Some people say it's the other way around. It was mainly McQuarrie and Solomon with a little bit of stuff brought together by Hayter. But essentially, with McQuarrie and Solomon taking their names off the film, apparently Hayter claims they gave up at least $1 million in the first year of residuals and credit bonuses. So they were obviously that pissed off that they didn't want the money for it.
Wow. My question to you, unless you've got more trivia on the script, is how good do you think the final script was?
It's okay. It's I mean, I think the problem with this film, and it's interesting because it's something that, ironically, going back to DC have struggled with. And if you think about the play that Marvel made, that they took their time and made, they did a few films before they did the big team up movie of the Avengers. They did
shared universes,
shared universe. Whereas with X-Men, they're a fully set, group, and it's a real task to establish a world, to build up all these hero characters, all these villainous characters, and to world build as well. So I think there's a lot of heavy lifting that needs to be done in this film. There is a lot of exposition. There's arguably not that much action and not that much compelling action. But
George, there's exposition on live TVs and a stall on a beach.
Yes, exactly. Exposition. So yeah, I think the script isn't brilliant. I think obviously the X-Men, this feels very much like a starting block. It almost feels like it's playing it safe at times. It helps that you've got a lot of exposition delivered by some of the greatest actors of all time. But yeah, I don't think it's considering the amount of people that are involved on the script, I don't think it's anything to write home about.
Well, for me, because how many films have there been? I've got the box set which came with Wolverine. So there's let's break it down. So there's the three original, the original trilogy. Then there's 3 Wolverine films. Then there's Sorry, there's 3 of the new ones, First Class,
Days of Future Past,
and Dark Phoenix.
Apocalypse, and Dark Phoenix.
Wow, have I seen Dark Phoenix?
There's 2. There's 2 Deadpool. I think there's about 13 of them now.
No, but my point is that I think that this film, as you say, I think the best way. Maybe it's not the time to talk about this, but I just think that this film is very much a foundation piece carried along by stellar performances from some of the best acting in the world. You've got a young Ian McKellen and a middle-aged Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart.
Yeah, I was going to say he's not young, but he's still going.
He's not young, but the fact that when there's that opening scene at the UN or whatever the thing is where Jean Grey's been speaking and they're having that talk in the stairwell or whatever it is, I've never seen these two this young for ages. That was my reaction. And it's Gandalf. He's a bad guy. There's all of that stuff going on, but I just feel like X-Men 2 wiped the floor with this, as did Days of Future Past. And I think obviously Deadpool's in another league of its own, different type of film. So I just think if you talk about those 13 films, I think this is good, but the only reason I'm saying this now is you spend a lot of time talking about the script, and this, maybe I watched it to death because, if I haven't said it already, ladies and gentlemen, this was probably the first DVD I ever owned. I had a PC computer, a compact PC computer that I watched this on, and I watched it to death, and I watched the extra scenes. So I've watched it again and again and again. And there's some great set pieces towards the end. There is some beginning and middle and end set pieces, but it's not what we get these days in terms of the quality. I don't feel there's enough. I feel like it's carried along by the quality of the actors it's got, rather than the quality of the story. I think the story's a bit flat, or maybe it's the special effects.
I think it is as well. You've got to think back. They're playing it safe in terms of the budget as well. So I think the budget was 75 million, which, obviously it's all inflation and what have you, but that's still quite quaint for a comic book film of that time. And, think that it's going rate for a comic book film is around 200 million, if not more these days. I know we're 20 odd years later, but that's still, I think, 75 million. And they had to cut a lot, that it would take, and I'm sure, let's have a quick look. I'm sure I will have, if we look at, so X-Men 75, let's look at one of the last ones. Let's look at Dark Phoenix. What did that cost? Dark Phoenix had a budget of 200 million. There you go.
There you go. There you go. So, is this a good time to talk about first memories? Since I've already started talking about how this is like my first DVD. Where were we? We got to understand, ladies and gentlemen, that George and I had left home.
I was still at school.
Yeah, I'd left home, and DVDs were out, and this is one of the first DVDs I bought. And I was like, George and I, no, but we were really getting into our film because there was a lot of stuff on the DVDs that I knew George was seriously into. He was going to go on and then study film. This is kind of why we have the podcast, but it was like DVDs came along with all of this extra stuff, all of the stuff that you can now look up on the internet, but it was like, it was the way to consume it. And I almost feel like I consumed more of the stuff that was on this DVD than the DVD itself.
Yeah. No, it's, I remember my first memories. I remember having, fold out poster that I got free, I think with Total Film magazine on my wall that had, it was a teaser poster so you could hardly see anyone's faces. They're all like obscured, and I remember having that up on my wall for like months before it came out. And yeah, there was, you know, jumping back to what we talked about in the intro, that we were both, you know, even though I was in my, you know, mid-teens, you were in your late teens, we were both big fans of the animated TV show on Fox Kids, and that hyped us up for the movie adaptation. And yeah, I think because of Batman had sort of, you know, Batman Robin had just come out and bombed, you know, Blade was a sort of picked up things again, and it gave us a bit of hope. But you know, Blade, we never really had heard of Blade outside.
I was going to say, I don't know about you, but I hadn't joined the dots between Blade and X-Men cartoon at this stage. Like, I can remember you saying to me one time, because this was in the years of Sky, you know, we had Sky, and we're like, ooh, yeah, and it was like we've got Fox Kids and Cartoon Network, and we would watch Spider-Man, we'd enjoy that, and we'd watch X-Men, and we'd just sit there listening to the sound shoot, the theme music. But I can remember you pulling me aside once and going, no, you've got to check this out. And I was like, what? It's just X-Men. You're like, no, there's like it's like a mini series, or it's like a featurette. It's called like Days of Future Past, and it's like this time traveler that's come back.
And you were like, time travel, I'm in.
I'm in. Back to the Future, Terminator, I'm in. But I can remember you telling me, it's like saying, no, we need to catch it. It's like, because this was in the time where, this was before you could record off Sky. And it's like, no, I think it's going to be on it. Because like, but Sky would repeat everything, you know. And I remember watching it, and the graphics were like very manga inspired. They were like really, really some brilliant sort of thing. And it was just the fact that it was like, everybody's at stake. There's X-Men from the future you've never seen before. And for me, it was just like world building. It was in a comic book style, but I don't know. I think that grew expectation, and that's, you want to take it from that in like sort of the 90s to where we got to in Endgame, where they had the portal sequence in Endgame, and you're just like, okay, thank you.
Yeah.
You know, like, well, so we've come from that beginning, and we've gone a long way. And you and I are not comic book nerds, but we enjoy the action side of it.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned that, and I don't know if I've said this on the pod before, but when I first got Disney Plus, one of the first things I did was I went back and I watched some of the old Spider-Man, the 90s Spider-Man cartoon, and I watched the Days of Future Past episodes on the old TV show, because I was like, oh, finally can go back and revisit it.
I haven't watched them. I haven't gone back to the original, and that's something I'm really tempted to do, because I really I've got that as a separate Blu-ray. I bought that, and I think that's a film we won't talk about now. We'll get to it some stage, but that film was just brilliant. The fact that we'd got the retro with what's his name? We've got Michael Fassbender and McAvoy. And then we've got Stewart, and I thought that was a brilliant bit of casting. And that was good, but it was almost like, I don't know, almost felt like that film didn't deliver, because I think it's very difficult to fulfill the imagination that when the baseline is what we saw in the X-Men animated series.
Yeah.
I think that's the problem, because in that you had like all of the characters taken out, all these massive robots and stuff.
Well, that's it. It took a long time to see, you know, the iconic enemies as the Sentinels appear on film, and it was something that I think they appeared in every single script And that was why they had to keep cutting back. They had to keep cutting back characters. They had to keep cutting back the Sentinels because they were just going to be, at the time, just too expensive. So the other two main characters that were cut from the script were Beast and Gambit. And Nightcrawler. Obviously, Nightcrawler crops up in X-Men 2 and is brilliantly realized there. But the Sentinels didn't properly appear until Days of Future Past. And the other thing that they cut was the Danger Room, which was, the virtual reality room where they do all their training. And that didn't make it. They open the start of X-Men 3, The Last Stand, is they're doing a training exercise in the Danger Room, and you glimpse a Sentinel's head, and then that's it. It's like a blink and you miss it type thing. So, yeah, it's interesting that was they were such an iconic villain in the TV series. It took so long to get the effects and budgets to actually bring them to life on film.
Well, I've got a theory about it. I feel like the plots and the narrative has evolved with us, because like I get the feeling like when we were younger, it was like, okay, George and Charlie are of this age. We need to show them Wolverine doing smashy smash with robots. And then as we've got to the age of watching these films at the cinema, it's like, oh, we're going to need a bit more of a psychological drama that deals with racial prejudice and, who can you trust and stuff like that. And I feel like they've almost dialed back. And then what would come later was the Marvel, which is, we're going to go smashy again, robots, giant robots fighting against giant robots. So I think, I don't know, it's like the double-edged sword in that I feel like I really have to pay respect to this film. But for me, my favorite's X2, because you've got Brian Cox, you've got we talked about this when we were covering, I guess it was Superman, when you're younger, and this came up with my son recently, which is better, the sequel. Yeah. The sequel's always better because it's newer, Daddy, it's newer. And yeah, I think we were probably still living a little bit of that. So
I remember going to see this at the cinema with one of my friends. I was excited
about this. Very excited.
But I remember walking out with my friend Andrew Eden, who was a big comic book fan and had read a lot of the X-Men comics, and we both said, yeah, it was good, but it kind of left you wanting more, and it kind of was a bit anticlimactic.
It was a bit meh, yeah.
And it almost feels like a pilot of a TV series, doesn't it? It's just
exactly.
Like it's
a pilot of a new franchise.
Well, that's it. It's setting up the characters, it's setting the style, and those bits it does really well. And there's some effects that are pretty good. There's some that hold up, and then there's some that have aged a bit badly. But yeah, as a whole, the action doesn't really stack up. I mean, the best probably fighters between Wolverine and Mystique,
and the best graphics are Mystique as well. Her transformation,
and there's a bit that I was really impressed with when the Senator just turns into giant jellyfish and then just explodes into a puddle of water. I was like, oh, that's pretty good. water
and Wolverine's healing,
and the claws are all pretty impressive. So yeah, I remember even when I was, I say in my teens, fresh out the cinema, I was like, yeah, it was good, but it could have given so much more. And sure enough, as you say, X2 completely delivered on that potential of what an X-Men film could be. The stakes were high. It had some amazing action. You saw Wolverine go properly nuts. It had, great writing, great villains, great set pieces, and had everyone super psyched. It's arguably, well, not arguably, it's up there with one of the best comic book films ever made.
And if you look at the decade it was made in, so it was I think saying that it's still to this day, even after everything Marvel's done, it's like you can't discount X2, the fact that Charles Xavier had a competitor, Wolverine had a competitor, Scott was taken out. Obviously we're getting into spoiler territory, but it was just like it was like the stakes. The stakes were just like, and the effects were a bit better. They were a bit more. I don't know. It just felt so true to the comic books. We're obviously big fans of the comic books, and I think I'm sure there's going to be people listening to this podcast who are like, we never ever seen the comic, what do you call it? The animated series, I guess. But check it out because it's great, and it's like the Spider-Man.
Well, you know what, Charlie?
The Spider-Man animated series is great as well.
They're actually bringing the cartoon back, so it's actually cool when they relaunched Disney, or when they launched Disney Plus. Out of all the things, they're like, oh yeah, we're doing these Marvel TV shows, we're doing these Star Wars shows, and we're bringing back animated X-Men, and it's called X-Men 97 because that's where it originally finished. But they're getting all the actors back to do the voices. They're going to keep the animation. Yeah, and they're going to keep the animation style the same. And it was due to come out, I think, like later this year, but I think they've pushed it back. I think it's coming out start of next year. So it shows how much of how embedded it is in the cultural consciousness of lapsed TV shows and animated shows. It's like, yeah, something that for over 25 years, well, let's bring it back.
Well, I've realized we've been talking a lot about X-Men, the franchise, what it means to us, the animated series, but in terms of the movie, one thing I just wanted to talk, what I was surprised about going back and watching this was Hugh Jackman was just like how different he is. Like I'm
how
talking
young.
about not just how young, because I did do the daddy chat. I was like, well, he's in pretty good shape. How old is he compared to me? And he's like, yeah, he's in his 30s in this film. But it's how different he is now to in the Wolverine. It's like, because he does obviously this role a few times, and he always remains completely studly and buff, and he only eats nothing but chicken or whatever it is.
Well, I think the reason
I'm saying his performance was different in this.
Okay, and what?
I just thought he was softly spoken. I just felt he was a lot more restrained. He gets a bit more confident and a bit more forthright in later films, whereas in this, maybe it's the animal stuff. I just feel like this was more of a performance piece than a character piece that he would become.
Well, it's funny. I mean, Wolverine's always been probably the most popular X-Men characters because he's a bit of an anti-hero. And yeah, that's always been the common complaint about the films. It's always they've always been built around Wolverine. And yes, I think that's down to his character, but it's also because this film is the making of a star. This is, Hugh Jackman's debut. I think this it's very important for a few things. Obviously, yeah, it's quite a small scale film that would then turn into a $1 billion 13 film franchise. But yeah, it gave us stars like Hugh Jackman, who it's his debut film. It's a brilliant performance, and it's really interesting to see because he was cast late in the day, and I think we touched on it. There's plenty more casting in coulda, woulda, shoulda, but we talked about this in Mission Impossible 2 episode, that Dougray Scott was cast, but because filming on MI2 was delayed and drawn out, and I think Dougray Scott got injured, they had to scramble and get an actor in last minute notice. So I think Hugh Jackman has something like 3 weeks prep, and that's why in this one he's actually got a realistic sort of physique, whereas in all the other ones he's veins popping, completely jacked. And yeah, that's one of the funny things watching this. But he's like, he's
reasonable.
He looks reasonable, but that's achievable. I could have a body like that. And then in the next one, it's just like properly. I don't know if it's until it might be in the Wolverine spin-off where he started getting ridiculously jacked up for it.
And the one that's silly was, I think, when he gets to sort of like last, not first class. It must be Days of Future, where it goes back in time, and it's like, okay, so we need to make him look younger, but he's also bigger. It's like, but yeah, I just enjoyed and also, I think that's what I was taking back to what I was saying before about it's interesting watching how we've spent a lot of time with Retro Ramble covering 80s and 90s films. And now I'm looking back at a time where we discovered Hugh Jackman. It's like, it's funny to look at that and you think about what an amazing career he's had and how he's evolved, and the Greatest Showman stuff, the multifaceted. In fact, he's been in the Prestige. He's such an interesting guy. He's such and he's had this, I would call it this luggage to carry. He was like, "You're going to do more Wolverine. You're contracted. We're going to need some more Wolverine out of you." You know, he's done a lot.
But yeah, it's taken him a while to sort of cement and to break away from it. Like, you know, obviously there's Swordfish. That was, I think, the first big film he did after this. And yeah, he had a few sort of, well, I'm not sure if they were turkeys or misfires, but it took a while before, yeah, as you say, films like The Prestige. But yeah, he's worked with some really Denis Villeneuve in Prisoners. He's done some really interesting, challenging roles, and yeah, he's become, I say, one of a star, and he's got his pick of his projects. He's always been a song and dance man, and he really pushed Greatest Showman and turned that into an unexpected success. So yeah, it's fantastic to see, and it's so interesting to see him back in very early days. And yeah, it's interesting, obviously, with casting, Patrick Stewart, I think, was always, top of the list because he's bald, and was big, or was, if you think
off the back of Star Trek next year.
Yeah, Star Trek was, I think, still running around that time, and Ian McKellen. This is pre Lord of the Rings, but
that's what I'm saying. It's like, yeah. I could do a bad guy or a good guy.
And Halle Berry, this is her pre-Oscar as well. So, but she was a fairly, mid-level name, but then she would obviously, I think, demand more money and be more visible in the films as they progressed.
And demand better script writing as well for her characters after this role.
Oh God,
she's great, but the lines in this are weak as anything. This is on Singer for me. I'm sorry, but I think he was focused on other actors, and I feel like she's an afterthought in this because the CGI and her scenes are so impressive, and her delivery and the lines they give her is just there's no direction there for me.
Oh, she gets that one. It's widely known as one of the worst payoff lines in film history. I think it was written by Joss Whedon. What happens to a toad when it's struck by lightning? The same as everything else. Yeah, and I think you're right. I think she gets a lot more to do in the sequels. One person that sadly was never really serviced well by these films, but continues to be in work and be great, is James Marsden as Cyclops. So this is, again, probably one of his when I was watching this with my wife, she's like, "Is that the guy from?" I was like, "Yes,
the guy from Peter Rabbit, the guy from Sonic, the guy from Westworld, the guy from everything." Yeah,
I was like, the guy that's in everything. That's him, and he's aged amazingly as well.
I just think he looks like a real gentleman, and he'd take you out for dinner, and he'd take really good care of you. He looks like
him and Hugh Jackman. Double team. Well,
but on the other side is the woman who I think I signed my life away to her. Was it 97 GoldenEye? Famke Janssen. My God, this is pre. No, this is after. This is just after. But she would then have to be saddled up with Liam Neeson getting kidnapped. Sorry, not kidnapped, taken.
Taken. You will be taken.
You will not say the word kidnapped.
Can't say kidnapped. So yes, this is, I think, probably one of her biggest roles after GoldenEye. So yeah, it's an interesting cast, and again, certain characters do get sidelined. So I don't feel. As brilliant as Patrick Stewart is, I don't feel he has much to do. He is just Mr. Exposition, but I think Charles Xavier was always kind of that character.
Yeah.
McKellen's brilliant, and again has more to do in the sequel. We're the future Charles, not them.
I just got lots of sound bites of him saying, "Oh, Charles." If I ever want to be told off, I've just got Ian McKellen's soundboard. It's like, "What are you doing, Charles?"
Yeah. So yeah, it is. I say that, and there's also, in terms of the other villains. So yeah, we've got Rebecca Romaine as the lovely Mystique. She's good.
Totally Billy Bollocks.
Totally Billy Bollocks. It's apparently 6 hours in makeup every day, going nuts.
Who was that makeup person? Are you sure you haven't done the blue on my breasts yet? No, Miss Romaine, it's going to take at least another 30 minutes.
Just a tiny bit more. So yeah, you've got Toad, who is played by Ray Park, who was obviously Darth Maul, and there's a little nice nod of him spinning a pole around in that, because that was, year after Phantom Menace. He doesn't have much to do. Sabretooth is kind of wasted, because in the comics and the cartoon he's Wolverine's sort of arch enemy, and they kind of is one of they tried to retcon and rejig that for the Wolverine spin-off movie, which X-Men Origins, which was terrible.
And but is Sabretooth, isn't he the guy with the two guns in Spider-Verse, in the first Into the Spider-Verse film? The guys with the two, oh no, that's Tombstone. Is that the two
are you thinking of the game? So,
not the game. No, not the game. In the first Spider-Verse, when they go to steal the PC and the computer.
Oh yes, yeah.
Who's the guy with the two guns?
That's Tombstone. Yeah,
it's Tombstone. Okay, so it's not Sabretooth.
Sure
Sorry, they kind of it's a T and an S the other way around. Comic books, man, I can't keep up with you. Yeah, we talked about a lot of the actors. Who else was? We got Rogue.
Yeah, I think Rogue is the biggest departure from the comics and the cartoon, because I think in the cartoon and comics she can fly and she's quite strong, whereas they've kind of retrofitted her to be more of a she's a bit like the plot device, isn't she?
Well, we've got to create a narrative for why does he care? What brings Wolverine back? What's he fighting for at the end? It's all for her. So and well, we haven't talked about him. Let's give him some Ian McKellen. Like, I think there's been enough. I can remember when Days of Future Past was coming out that they were doing some show together, Sir Patrick Stewart and Sir Ian McKellen, in that they are, yes, obviously UK national treasures for us, but just the idea of them playing a game of chess together or just talking is like, the idea of them being nemesis across the table about anything, it's just such a brilliant setup. And you could almost it's almost like one of them should have been M and the other Blofeld. It's like, why didn't we discover this? Because they're both brilliant at delivery. They're both brilliant actors, and they're happy to, they're not, what's the word I'm looking for? You said before about the role he plays, Professor Xavier. He's happy to be, I'm just here for exposition. I don't necessarily need to do this,
Yeah.
They're happy to take their roles and drive the story along. But I did think Ian McKellen looked chipper and young compared to, I was like, oh, yeah, this is pre-Gandalf. This is, and obviously when he's Gandalf, he's made to look even older.
Yeah.
And then, what a time of movies it was. And a time for DVDs. So, George, are we ready for Coulda, Woulda, Shoulda?
Well, I think let's get serious for a second, and we have to approach the elephant in the room that we haven't really talked about the direction of this film, the director of this film. So, yeah, Bryan Singer, who was pretty much
he was so hot. He was so hot back in the day,
untouchable for many years, and in more ways than one, because it only really, I think it was around the time he was making Bohemian Rhapsody, which was, I think, around 2016, 17 maybe. It was
2017, I would say, yeah.
Yeah, it was pre-pandemic, and he was fired off that because he just wasn't turning up to set and he was being erratic. And then within months, loads of allegations came out of various people saying he'd been groping people, he'd been really unprofessional, he'd been erratic on set, he'd been assaulting like teenage boys and stuff like this, and more stories came out, and there's loads of articles online if you want to read some really depressing stuff. But I read there's a really interesting Hollywood Reporter article about how it wasn't just Singer in his later years. It was from the very off. There was reports uncovered from the original X-Men. The guy that plays Pyro in it, obviously it's more of a cameo in this film, and it's a different actor and a much fleshed out character in the sequel. But the guy that played Pyro in this came forward and claims he was raped by Singer and 3 other people repeatedly over several months. And apparently Singer said in interviews at the time he was taking pain medication for a bad back. Apparently the set report saying his drug use was problematic. He would arrive late on set, mood swings, explosive tantrums. And here's an interesting bit of trivia. So we've talked about the producer, Lauren Schuler Donner. Her number 2, her assistant at the time, a young executive called Kevin Feige. And he was sent to set to keep Bryan Singer in line and make sure that the film was being produced. So Kevin Feige, before he became the godfather of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, cut his teeth on the X-Men films.
So he knows where the dead bodies are buried, basically.
Pretty much. And it's interesting because I've watched some as you know, you've talked about it as well, in all the behind the scenes and the DVD extras, you've got Lauren Schuler Donner talking about the importance of the story and how brilliant it is and putting on, you know, the brave face. But there's an interesting quote from her here, and she's talking about Bryan Singer. She says, he was very nervous and he would act out when he was insecure, as many people do. His way of acting out would be to yell and scream at everyone on set or walk off the set and shut down production. And she apparently declined to attend the X-Men premiere out of frustration with him. And she says, you have to understand the guy was brilliant. And that was why we all tolerated him and cajoled him. And if he wasn't so fucked up, he would be a really great director.
Bit of a shame.
Yes, it seems like even though he was, hot property, there was allegations on this film. They still came back and said, yep, make X-Men 2. He was going to make X-Men 3 before he jumped ship to make Superman Returns. He carried on making, films. It was only until Bohemian Rhapsody that blew up, and, for the wrong reason, he was fired off that he hasn't had work since because of all these allegations. So, yeah, I think it just needs to be addressed. I mean, these, as I say, they have been brilliant films, but it seems like there's been, a fair few people, have had their careers ruined or affected by his behavior offset or off camera, I should say.
Yeah, it's a shame because he was part of some big movies. So,
and I have one more. I have to just after that sort of serious and quite depressing trivia. I have a bit of heart-lifting trivia. So, do you know who one of the stunt coordinators was on this film, Charlie?
I don't, but I feel like you're going to tell me.
It was before, in his sort of in between his acting, between acting as a child and his renaissance in Everything Everywhere All at Once. Ki-Hoo Kwon was one of the stunt coordinators on this, and you can see him in some of the behind the scenes features, like blocking out stuff with.
He's coming back to the podcast. He's going to get back. He's got a big film in his wheelhouse. I just know it.
So yes, I remember reading that, and then I saw some special features, and there he crops up like he's blocking out the fight between Mystique and Wolverine. So yes, that is all I have to say in terms of trivia, good and bad. But yeah, should we get
Jeff says he's never heard of Bryan Singer, and Celine Dion just wants to sing. So coulda, woulda, shoulda is where George enlightens us for the actors or directors or anybody else who's considered for important roles in the film who, for whatever reason, did not get selected. So, George, when it comes to X-Men 2000, that sounds like a title in itself. When it comes to the first X-Men film, who could have... We've talked about Dougray, could have been in the Wolverine role, but who else was considered and didn't get the part?
Okay, we'll do. I've got actors and directors. So we'll do. So back when Catherine Bigelow and James Cameron were in talks, Bob Hoskins was penciled as the top choice for Wolverine, because in the comics Wolverine is quite short and stout as well. So that was
hilarious to me. So this is off the back of his success out of Roger Rabbit. No, that would come later.
Yeah. No, it was about the same time as Roger Rabbit. But that was one of when this film was made, few people had gripes about Hugh Jackman because he's too tall. He's too tall to be Wolverine. So it's quite funny that people are saying whoever at some point will have to play Wolverine that's not Hugh Jackman, it's going to be big shoes to fill. But yeah, so Bob Hoskins was considered for Wolverine, and kind of unsurprising because it's Angela Bassett, and would go on to make Strange Days. But Angela Bassett was considered as Storm, which I think she would have been brilliant.
That would have been a good shout. Yeah.
Yeah. But come to when they were casting it for the Bryan Singer version, the first person that was approached to play Wolverine was another Australian. Who do you think it was, Charlie?
Could have been Russell Crowe.
Oh, well, of course it was, mate. Of course it was.
Oh, I bet he likes punching people, starting fights,
fighting around the world. But yeah, so he turned it down, and he was the one that suggested Hugh Jackman. But they were like, we haven't heard of him. We're going to go and approach a few other people. So they then went to Viggo Mortensen, and Viggo Mortensen had several meetings with them. But ironically, one of the reasons he turned it down was because he didn't want to be locked into multiple films, and then would go on to be...
The last thing I would need in my life right now is a franchise.
But ironically, he was, like Hugh Jackman, he was a last-minute replacement for Aragorn in the Lord of the Rings films. It was, I think, Stuart Townsend was cast and started filming, and then they sacked him a few weeks into filming. So yes, Viggo Mortensen was in the role. And then for Cyclops, Jim Caviezel,
the guy from the first one,
the guy from the Passion of the Christ, he was originally cast as Cyclops, but backed out due to scheduling conflicts with the film Frequency. But I've saved the best for last in terms of casting, Charlie, because there was one person who actively campaigned for the role of Xavier, but was never seriously considered, and that is Michael Jackson.
Oh my God.
It sounds like some sort of a joke, the fact that I'm just going to be looking after all these gifted children.
I've got a school full of children. I'll shave my hair off. No, but what the hell? What?
So, yeah, I don't know like where that's come from, but I've read that a few places that he actively campaigned for it. But yeah, let's jump back to directors that were considered before Bryan Singer. So Brett Ratner was considered. He would go on later to direct nobody's favorite X-Men film, X-Men The Last Stand, the third one.
Vinnie Jones, anybody?
Yeah. They also offered it to Robert Rodriguez, who turned it down. And after the commercial success of Mortal Kombat, a previous Retro Ramble feature, Paul W.S. Anderson was offered it, but he decided to go off and make cult classic Event Horizon instead.
Okay. Well, I think probably the most interesting we kind of covered before. I think I wanted to say, because we didn't cover him, coulda, woulda, shoulda, we mentioned him on the MI2 film and earlier. I think Dougray Scott would have made a very good Wolverine. And
I think he would.
I think he would have turned into a Gerard Butler type character. I think he could have had as many films off the back of it. I think he's been given short shrift.
No, I think we did chat about this in MI2, and I think he's, well, as we talked about in that episode, he's one of the things I love about MI2. I mean, it's a pure panto villain, but he's giving it his all. And yeah, I think he would have that same sort of gruff intensity that Jackman brings to it. I mean, he's obviously, I think it was a good thing because it gave the world Hugh Jackman, but it is a very interesting, I think the Dougray Scott thing, as I said back at the time, it's one of the biggest coulda, woulda, shouldas I think that we've been faced with.
Well, no offense to either actor here, but I almost think in the back of my head that I think Dougray Scott would have done a better job of Wolverine through it gave us Hugh Jackman. I think Hugh Jackman, my point is, I think Hugh Jackman would have been, this is where we discovered him. And it's almost like, can we not have both? Can we not have the Hugh Jackman career that came from this and actually just dropped? Because I think Dougray Scott would have done a brilliant job in these roles. I think.
I think Russell Crowe would have been very good in it as well.
I like Russell Crowe in everything that he's done.
Yeah.
It's like, I was thinking this about Ian McKellen. It says a lot about an actor when they could do a great good guy and a great bad guy. And I put both McKellen and Russell Crowe in that. Who the other bad guy? More recently, the guy who plays Homelander in The Boys. was speaking out, saying that people who look up to him don't really get the point of the show. But in the comments I was reading online, I think you've watched The Boys, yeah? And
I haven't watched it all, but
you've watched at least the first series. You know the guy I'm talking about, the
yeah,
Captain America,
Superman
guy,
Anthony something, I think he's called. But yeah, he's brilliant.
No, but he's not just brilliant. You can't take your eyes off him. He's like a Jack Nicholson. He's like and that's what I think about the McKellens and about this and about who we were just talking about. Sorry, Dougray Scott in Mission Impossible. That you can't take your eyes off them, and that is a sign of a great villain. And it's something, keeping this in the comic book world, something that Marvel struggled with. They were like, how do we get a good bad guy? Bond,
and let's just keep putting. Let's put Loki in everything.
Yeah, well, the thing is, like, Bond had like 2, 3, 4 years each year, and it's like a Bond film. It's always based on how good is the Bond and how good is the bad guy. And I think we've all seen Marvel films that have struggled with the MacGuffin and the effects and the character and the origins. And they go, oh shit, we need it, and they've fumbled. But it's everything, and so. Yeah, I think I don't know what else there is to say about X-Men. It's been interesting to go back, and I think we keep talking about how many films these have spawned. In summary, for me, I think there's been unfortunately, because there's 13, I think there's probably 7 bad films and 6 good ones.
I would say that as well. I mean, yeah, there has been some brilliant films. But yeah, it's almost like it's almost not as bad as like the Star Trek sort of, odd, even sort of conundrum. But yeah, I think it is close. I mean, there are some brilliant ones, as we've talked about, Days of Future Past. We haven't really talked about Logan is obviously, one of the best films, comic book films. Yeah. Deadpool is part of this universe. So, but yes, there are some
even the Wolverine. Wolverine's a great film.
It is until it gets smashy CGI at the end with the silver samurai robot.
Silver samurai thing. Giant robot. Yeah, but it's like, come on, get out.
Yeah, no, it is a lot of fun until that point. Wolverine and ninjas. What's more? What more do you need?
Samurai Wolverine. So, excellent. Okay, well, anything else you want to say?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of an odd one, as you say. Like when I was telling my wife that we were covering this for the podcast, she was like, "But that film's not that old." I was like, "Babe, it's 23 years old."
Yeah.
So it's an interesting, and I think it is. Yeah, it's interesting. It still feels, because the X-Men films are still, the last one came out still very, very recently. There's Deadpool 3 is on the way. I don't know, because Deadpool can be fast and loose, whether it's going to be connected to the films, but they're bringing back Hugh Jackman we thought Logan was the last appearance of his Wolverine, but they're bringing him back.
They like working together.
I really, because of their banter offline, on social and stuff. I'm looking forward to that. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So yeah, I'm glad we covered it. I say it feels like a small film in comparison to the rest, and obviously I think it's an important film because it helped pave the way for Marvel, as you've said. This is pre-Spider-Man as well. Spider-Man would explode huge on the screen a couple of years later.
Well, but yeah, just on that point. Sorry, just something it was something I wanted to say earlier. It's like, how with Marvel, with DC, they all do these things where we're going to do this film, and if it works, we're establishing a franchise,
Yeah.
And I think this film is so important because I think it was a roll of the dice, and I think it established the franchise of franchises. Do you know what I mean? I feel like this is the test flight of, if we make this work, and I think this led to everything you're talking about, Spider-Man, Blade, like all of these films that would follow.
Yeah.
Sorry, I think Blade was earlier. I keep forgetting the first Blade was earlier.
But yeah, I think even though it's a small film, it's not the best film. It's still an important film in comic book history. So yeah, I'm glad we covered it.
Cool. Okay. Well, that's been X-Men. What have we got coming up, George, that listeners can look forward to, either on the usual monthly podcast or on our Patreon channel?
Well, I'm sure on our Patreon channel, we will be covering some recent releases. So there's obviously quite a few blockbusters out at the minute. So Charlie and I will be covering them over the summer. But on the regular podcast, we've got a biggie coming up. It's the 40th anniversary. I've just turned 40, but it's also the 40th anniversary of 2 Bond films, Octopussy and Never Say Never Again. So we're going to do them both back to back.
So we're doing Never Say Never Again.
Never Say Never Again with a little bit of Octopussy. So yes, it's going to be a bumper episode. There's going to be bad impressions galore. There's going to be a lot of... It's going to be a
long one. There's going to be at least an hour of George and I doing impressions of either Sean Connery or Max.
And Roger Moore.
Roger.
And there's going to be lots of me talking sexy court cases, sexy talk about sexy litigation.
That's a bit of a bumper Bond episode, and that's going to be in time for a bit of a bumper Bond bank holiday that you normally expect to watch Bond over a bank holiday, and I think that's probably when we're going to drop that episode.
Yes. So, yes, you've got that to look forward to. I think we're going to have a lot of fun with that. We haven't done a Bond film for a while, so yes, we're looking forward to that. But wonderful. Yes, just to jump back, if you are a fan of Bond and you want to hear Charlie and I's thoughts on Bond, we did some Bond specials on our Patreon channel. We covered things like top Bond soundtracks, Bond villains, Bond actors. So there's a lot of Bond content, best of sort of moments for the 60th anniversary that you can check out, I say, on our Patreon, amongst other films like cult films and recent releases. So if you need more retro ramble in your life, please check out our Patreon channel.
Excellent. Check us out on all of the social medias with their Retro Ramble blog. Obviously, the main blog site is retroramble.blog. We look forward to speaking to you next time. For this episode, I've been Charlie McGee.
I've been George McGee.
And I will see you next time.
Old friend.
Goodbye.